Would you like for me to go ahead and share my screen?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Not quite yet. As more are logging in here, let me share with you that, as I mentioned a little moment ago, we will be recording this and make it available for those of you who have access to the faculty blog. You'll see a link to that. If you don't have access, please email me at rupchurch@belhaven.edu, and I'll make sure that you do have access to the faculty blog. We're glad you could join us today for this webinar. I think you're going to find it extremely interesting. Dr. Hall has been really a leader across all of our campuses in distributing information about APA and holding up APA as a standard for our faculty. And she's done a tremendous job with that. A lot of experience working with that. She's going to show you some things that I think you'll find interesting and be able to answer some questions related to APA that I think are going to make a big difference for you. And so in that respect, I think we're ready to go. Dr. Hall, take it away.
Okay. Let me make sure. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And can you see the screen that says APA webinar?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Upchurch. I'm excited and nervous about presenting today. I'm more excited, but I wanted to make sure that I spoke with my peers and the faculty to offer some APA quick tips. I think these are foundational pieces that are good for us to exercise in all of our classes, not just limited to our English courses. So I'm going to make this as interactive and as fun as I possibly can. And I would like for you all to relax, but very much stay alert, because I am asking that you remain involved and excited throughout this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask along the way. But once again, I am Kotina Hall, and we will be focusing on the APA webinar called Removing the Guesswork. So our session goal, we'll begin with our session goals, and the APA webinar will focus on helping instructors understand the APA requirements as it relates to the Belhaven APA guide. We will focus on common examples to make sure that we are standardized, we use uniformity, and we ward off plagiarism. So I tried to simplify the webinar as well as instruction in my classes by making it very simple, because what I found is that students and faculty alike are fearful as it relates to citing and referencing. So I ask that in our classes, we do our best to keep it as simple as possible in order to minimize and reduce fear. So there are two distinct methods for in-text citations, and it's simply direct quoting and indirect quoting. So I'd first like to ask, do you know what those components are? And I think it's important as professors that we are very clear about the components that makes up both our direct and indirect. So first we'll start with our direct. There are 4 components that should exist when in-text citating directly: those author's name, the year, the page number, and direct quotations. And I purposely asked students to write down those 4 components, and as they are constructing their work, to make sure that they balance the citation by having these components when directly quoting. So here's an example. I wanted to list some of the common mistakes that we see in our classes. So from these 2 examples, example A and example B, I'd like for you to take a moment for you to decide which is correct. Now, you don't need to tell me, and I won't call you out, but I want you to just take a second or 2 and let's look to see which one is correct. Okay. Keep in mind the previous screen, those 4 components that are necessary to ensure that you are in sync. All right. So if you look at example A is not the, Excuse me, I moved too fast. Let me go back and let me show you which one is actually correct. If you look at example B would be correct. You have the author's name, followed by the year, including the quotations, as well as the page number. Now, I want you to pay close attention to example A. Some of the most common mistakes that we see our students use is something as simple as notice the two periods, one at the end of the quotation and then one behind the parentheses. Now, I haven't deciphered in my instructing if students do that to make us guess which is correct or if they simply do not know. But notice the period will be placed at the end of the sentence. The second error that you may notice there are the quotations. They put the quotations, the student sometimes put the quotations at the end of the sentence, but around the parentheses. Notice that is totally incorrect. And one way you may want to look at it is to have the student to read it out loud. For instance, we'll focus on the final three words, for the future. So the author did not say, for the future, page 55, quotations. If you speak to them literally about it and speak openly, they can see it as well as hear the error caught there. So if you chose example B, you are correct. Okay, so those are two. Here's two examples of how to cite direct quotes. Now notice example A was the example that we just reviewed together. But notice example B, all of the components are placed at the end of the direct quote. That would be acceptable. You have the author's name, you have the year, you have the page number, and notice the quotations that began the sentence. That would be a correct example as well. So students have two alternatives. Now, students often ask, well, Dr. Hall, if I decide to place all of my information at the end to keep it simple, is that acceptable? And that is acceptable. But as they become more astute in their writing, we want them to use the two examples interchangeably. This will help them to appear more solid and sound in their writing. However, if they choose to do it the same way throughout, that is acceptable as well. Now we're going to talk about indirect citations. Very, very similar to the direct. The example, the only difference is that we are paraphrasing, excuse me. We are going to paraphrase. We're going to put it in our own words, but we are going to give the author credit for the idea. And that is very important to state that, because many times students will state one or two words and say, oh, okay, it's mine. No, we want to give the author credit for the idea. So for those components, you would have the author's name, the year, and the page number. Now, Belhaven, our guide says the page number is optional. And one of the things that I would, I encourage my students to do is, if you want to list the page number, I really do encourage that. Now, sometimes it can confuse the reader because it doesn't say exactly what is quoted on the page, but it does give that reader a general idea of the author's message. Okay. So once again, I have included the common errors that students sometimes make when citing, and I want you to look at example A and example B, and I want you to determine which is correct. Okay. Now, if you chose, again, Kotina gets so exciting, I'll move too fast. I'm going to go back. If you chose example A, you are correct. Notice example B includes quotations. That is a clear indicator that this is not an indirect quote, but rather a direct quote. All right, and then again, here are two examples of how to indirect quote. Notice we can have, we can start off with the author's name, or you can look at example B with all of the information being included at the end. And then once again, a side note will be to understand that students have the option to use those interchangeably or to use example A or example B throughout the work. But again, we want to encourage them to use both as they become more comfortable with their writing. Now, Many times we get confused as to biblical rules, and it is very important, and I have my guide here. It's very important that we encourage our students to use the APA guide because it's not for us to remember. The more that we become comfortable with using the guide and the more that we practice citing and referencing, we too will become more knowledgeable and less apt to have to use the APA guide. But until then, think of the APA guide as our Bible. It's our second book of law. So here are some common errors that I see students make as it relates to our biblical terms, and I wanted to make sure I pointed these out as well. So once again, professors, do you know? Should the word Bible always be capitalized? Should the word scripture always be capitalized? And should the Bible be listed as a source on the reference page? I think these are profound questions that students often ask. But if we look at our APA guide on page 5, it clearly gives us clear direction as to the Bible. And I'm going to read these specifically. So if you answered yes, should the word Bible always be capitalized? And should the word scripture always be capitalized? And you said yes, then you are absolutely correct. And our detail says that because it refers to the sacred book, it is a proper noun and they are always capitalized. Always, always, always. Number 3, should the Bible be listed as a source on the reference page? The Bible does not have to be listed as a source on the reference page because consider it the law. However, I often tell students that a professor might ask you to list that on the reference page. And should that happen, we are to follow suit. But it is not to be listed, and it does not have to be listed on that reference page. Okay? Citing the Bible. Once again, I'm going to go to my APA guide to assist me, and this just gets us in the habit of using that guide to do just that, to guide. Here it is a scripture, and one of the things that I want to make sure that we take note of, because I see it repeatedly in our classes here in Atlanta, the first time that the student introduces the Bible version, they are to spell it out in detail. However, if the student remains with that same scripture throughout, the student no longer has to say the King James Version. However, if the student changes, if only once, that student is to explain or detail the version each time he or she shares a scripture directly with the reader, because you want to remove the guesswork. So I'm not sure if she's using King James Version, a New Living Translation. So once you make the change, you must tell the reader, you must alert the reader throughout which version that you are using. Okay. Now, it seems like a lot of information to remember, but guess what? We can remove the guesswork, but just by reading and utilizing our guide. So here are some common reference rules, and while they may seem very, very simple, which I deem they are, here are some rules to help us remembering as we are instructing or constructing referencing pages. So every citation, here's a rule of thumb I like to say. For every citation, there has to be a reference, and every reference, there has to be a citation. And it helps the reader to stay aligned for their in-text as well as their reference pages. And remember, the Bible does not have to be referenced or listed on the reference page. All sources are alphabetized by the last name. The first line is flush left, the second is indent, and every source type has its own rule. Do not guess, use the guide. One of the things that we need to continue to encourage our student is to really use the guide, because every source is different. The journal doesn't look like a book doesn't look like a newspaper does not appear as an electronic source. Every source type has its own rule. And as I said in our faculty workshop this past weekend, don't guess it, don't add, don't take away, just follow what you see. Okay. Now, I wanted to construct a reference page just to give you an idea of some of the errors that we sometimes witness when students are creating a reference page. So I'll give you a few moments to look at this particular list and tell me what is incorrect. Silently tell me that is. Okay. So one of the first errors that we see is that the word references is flush left, and that should be centered. The next rule that we see is, that error that we see is that the word references is capitalized. Only the R should be capitalized, and it should not be bolded. If you look at the list itself, it is out of alphabetical order. Williams would not appear before Hall, and so forth, so on. We really want to be careful about that, because once they get that first two or second out of place, then it's almost down here for them to organize their references alphabetically. Another area that you would see is, notice the book reference from K. Hall. Patches meets leadership in Atlanta, and then you have the colon, time to learn more. They must pay attention to those rules, because this is a book reference. And how I know here we see a publishing company. But notice at the end, there is no period. And the only source type that does not have a period at the end would be an electronic reference, a www something. So be careful of that, because if you leave out or add to any component, you could actually change the source type. But I want to go back to that title I was just referencing, Patches Meets Leadership in Atlanta. Notice that the word patches is capitalized, as it should be, because that's the title of the book, the first word of the book. But notice meets leadership should not be capitalized. The source reference says for a book, the M and the L would be lowered. The only thing that should be capitalized is the A, because that's a proper noun. But notice what happens after the colon, the subtitle. The rules should begin all over again. So you should capitalize the T in time, and everything else should be lowercase unless a proper noun exists. So that's just one example of ensuring that we follow the rule, because the rules will vary per source type. And then lastly, if you look on the reference list, you see Sharon Jackson. The name Sharon should not be spelled out, but instead should be abbreviated. So much detail and many errors existed in this references. But in order to know that, we must use our APA guide as a checklist. Now this will be
I have a question.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
On the electronic documentation, should it not say the date that it was retrieved?
And are we looking at J. Williams, Obesity and the Signs?
I lost it.
That's okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. You should.
Oh, I'm sorry. It did say retrieved from, but there's no date.
Right. And if you see the date, that lets you know that you're using a dated edition. In the past, previous editions did state that we are to include the date that we retrieved it, but our current editions do not specify that.
Okay, thank you.
Very welcome. Any other questions? Okay, good question. Here is an example of a perfect reference page. And I think it covered, or it should cover, everything that I just mentioned. And notice the only thing that I did not mention in the era examples would be the italics. That's very important. And our APA guide does spell those out. So make sure you are following what you see. As you see, the first reference would be a book reference. And notice that the title of the book is italicized. Notice the second reference is a journal, but notice the journal itself is italicized. And then in that last one with J. Williams, that actually is a book or an article online, but notice the title again is italicized.
Dr. Hall?
Yes.
Do we still double space within and between references, or has that changed? I'm not sure really.
Yes, it still should be double spaced in between. And it may look a little funny here just because it's a PowerPoint. So
in the references themselves, would there be a double space between like the K Hall line and the Hush Publishing line also?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. Yes.
Just make sure. Thank you.
Very welcome. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to see some of our work in action, and I actually created a mini dummy paper for us to look at in terms of grading, how we would grade an in-text citation as well as referencing. So Dr. Upchurch, I guess we're going to stop here, and I need to switch over to Canvas.
Choose share your screen again.
There. Okay, I can't tell what you're seeing. Can you see my?
We can.
You can't see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Yay, okay, wonderful. All right. So do you see the Unit 1 in-class writing assignment? Okay, good. So I'm going to go to the class assignment loaded on October 10th. Notice I'm going to grade in SpeedGrader. But before we do that, notice the similarity score. That is very important, 0%, almost unheard of, but that's what we're looking for. We want to stay somewhere between 20% or less. Okay. So I am using SpeedGrader as an opportunity to look for Turnitin scores. Hold on, got an error here. Let's go to the next student, sorry.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
The similarity score, we're looking for 20% or less. How do you address it with students if you're getting something greater than that, like a 40 or 50 or even 60%?
Okay, and that'll buy me time while I figure out why this paper isn't coming up. Good question. One of the things that we want to make sure that we're looking at, when you look at a high score, there could be various reasons. One, students could actually be citing correctly, direct quotes, but they are using too much of the author's voice and not enough of their voice. So when that happens, it is critical for professors to go through each note, which the Turnitin score, the Turnitin score will provide, where that source came from, the origin of it, how the similarity. So it is important that you just do not look at that score collectively, but that you do comb through each one to ensure, oh, okay, well, Kotina actually did cite correctly. However, you want to make sure it doesn't become a copy-paste situation. And in those cases, I tell students, hey, while you have cited it correctly, make sure that you paraphrase here and there so we hear your voice as well as the author's voice. Does that help? Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, let's see. I can't figure out why my paper is not coming up, so let's see. All right, here we go. All right, notice notice the student has loaded the paper and you have the running head. I'm not going to focus so much on the
Lucy.
Hello? Okay. Notice the setup of the paper. You have the title cover page, and then we're going to move down to the writing itself. Now, I have placed pre-comments here just so that you can see, but I'm going to add additional comments so that you can understand how I derived at those comments. So I am focusing on purposely citing and referencing, but I did make sure that this paper was sound in terms of syntax and subject-verb agreement. So the first statement, and I'll just hover over it so you can see, I grabbed the point annotation and I placed it in this area because I wanted the student to know specifically where the feedback was related. So here I said, this statement appears to be a direct quote, so you are missing the details specific to a direct quote. And how did I know that? It's critical that you look at how I derived at that. So this is how I derived at. So she has an in-text citation here where I'm circling, but notice if you scroll down to her reference page, she's listed that as a book. Okay, so that tells me that that should be a page number inclusive. This is a tangible book. And I know that based on how she constructed the source. Okay. Now let's go to the second instance. Here I said, you are missing, let's see, she has a direct quote from Oprah Winfrey. She had quotations here, but she did not include ending quotations here. So here I provided feedback. Now, I'll show you in a second the APA checklist, which is housed on our resource page. And it says that for APA errors to use, to deduct 3 points. So this is how I derived at the grade here, a grade out of 50. I didn't arbitrarily just said, okay, you're almost there, so I'm just going to give you some points. No, make sure that I use the APA checklist as a point of reference. So that's your 3 points for this one, your 3 points for that one. That's, I came up with the 44 score. And that's it. Any questions here? One of the things that it's clear it's necessary for us to do is make sure that when you're looking at in-text citation that you're also balancing it against the reference page. Remember I said for every citation, she has Belhaven University here. We should be looking for Belhaven University on her reference page. She has Oprah Winfrey here, but notice, and I just caught an error, and we can, that's a feedback, we can do it together. She has Oprah Winfrey here. So remember, I deducted 6 points, but let's go down to her reference page, and I just caught this. Remember, the author's name is never spelled out in the reference page. You have the option to spell it out in the citation area. So here would be another point because, the author's first name should not be capitalized. Be sure to reference your APA guide example. All right.
You don't mean it shouldn't be capitalized. You mean it shouldn't be written in full.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It shouldn't be spelled out. How about that?
There you go. And
thank you for the, thank you.
Not first name.
The author's first name, that's right.
Good.
All right, so very good. Teachable moment. So that's 3 more points deducted. So that would now make that 44 to 41. All right. We are done here, and now we're going to go back to our PowerPoint, okay? Give me one moment to stop sharing. Jesus,
while you're doing that, going back to your PowerPoint, the point list that you shared, what was the name of that? The APA reference guide or APA summary guide, Kotina?
The APA
checklist.
The APA checklist.
The APA checklist.
Yes, sir.
You may not all have access to that, and I will include that information along with the recording for this so that you can see the points that Dr. Hall typically deducts for various errors in this respect. Of course, we don't require you to follow that, but it's certainly, you can certainly see how reinforcing this with a strong point value does probably force the student to come to grips with the material more quickly.
Thank you, Dr. Upchurch. All right, now we've just had an opportunity to review our working action. And let me get back to here. Now that you know, do you have any questions? Okay, well, our solution is to remove the guesswork and use your guide. I thank you so much for your attention.
Dr. Hall.
Yes, yes, yes.
Quick question. You
Okay.
said you were using Speed Grader. Is that a requirement? Because I actually prefer to use the Turnitin feedback solution.
Right, we have the option to use both. That's
Okay.
just my preference, yes. We have the option to use both. But the one thing that I want to emphasize is that we are using either. We have found that sometimes professors are not turning in, they are allowing students to submit their class to them in manually or tangibly submit their work. And we really need to move away from that, because these tools really help us to ensure that we are not moving into areas of plagiarism, and that we can make sure that we are aligned with our Belhaven standards, university standards.
Dr. Hall,
Yes.
just curious, you had like an acronym for ACTION. Does each letter mean something?
No, sir. I just
No,
thought
it's just to point it out. I love it. That's good.
No, I just thought it was
You
fun.
probably had a reason for that. I wasn't sure.
Good question, though. Any other questions?
I have a question. Dr. Upchurch, you said you would upload the APA checklist.
Yep.
Is it possible to get that in an email, or how do we find that on here?
You won't be able to find it on here. I can, I have a copy of it, and I have a copy from the workshop on Saturday, so I can do that. I can send that to you if you like, Erin.
Now, Dr. Upchurch, most of our, and I think I'm speaking correctly, but on our each of our branch campus websites, it should be within our faculty resources. Can I stop sharing and kind of go there to see and
Sure.
provide some steps? And maybe it may be there. Just one second.
Go for it.
Let me get out of this.
While you're looking for that, what is your opinion on formulating a few little pearls of wisdom and sharing that with the students at the beginning of the semester so that they're aware of some of these things? Because I'm finding that a lot of, not a lot of, some of our students are completely blind to APA format, and it's almost like they've never had to write. So is there, would it be wrong to give them just a little heads up on a few common errors?
Absolutely not. At the Atlanta campus, I actually encourage strongly our professors to review, spend some time incorporating that first class APA and library resources. So we do have somewhat of a little cheat and checklist to make sure that we are introducing to some and reinforcing to others how to use APA. So I encourage that.
Okay, great. Because our RN to BSNs, they don't do much writing in the ADN program at all. So this is all Greek to them,
right?
From what I've noticed.
Yes, but one of the reasons that's kind of a twofold. I like it. Why I like for us to have a cheat sheet is sometimes keep our students from using the APA guide, because they do have that. So I have mostly, I ask the professors to include foundational pieces such as a book, electronic source, but I do not allow them, I do not encourage them to get into it heavily, because it keeps the students from going to or utilizing the APA guide to its full extent. So.
Completely agree. Thank you very much.
All right, I think I'm in a place where I can share it, and I'm almost certain that the other campuses have this as well. So I'm going to start sharing again.
And I've just placed a link in the chat area. So on Zoom, if you click on your chat area, I've just placed a link to the APA Quick Guide for those of you who aren't necessarily working in the adult studies area, but you want to have access to our Quick Guide. It's there.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
not if you're in Addison, I can see you. Are you able to see my dashboard? Okay, so from here, if you notice Belhaven Atlanta campus, if you click here, and if I scroll down to resources, I actually have an APA grading checklist. But notice I should also have a grammar checklist. So 2 different checklists. So I'm going to check on the APA checklist guide, and the form that Dr. Upchurch was referencing is here. So those are general guidelines, and it's an awesome rubric to assist you along the way. And so this is what I was using to calculate the points. Any other questions?
No, thank you for sharing.
You are very welcome. Well, if nothing else, thank you so much for your time. And if I can be of assistance, I am khall@belhaven.edu, Kotina Hall. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Hall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you
Kotina.
all for attending. That concludes our presentation, and I will upload the presentation as soon as possible to our website. Dr. Hall, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
And
Got
we are in great shape. Thank you all once again.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.